All right, so we are on chapter 6 and we're starting section 1. Chapter 6 is all about carbohydrates. So lots of different things that we're going to talk about. We're going to be able to classify carbohydrates. We're going to talk about the functional groups of those carbohydrates. We'll talk about stereochemistry, which is really three-dimensional shapes of our carbs. And then we'll talk about how they react and how we form multiple chains like disaccharides and polysaccharides and things like that. And then we'll talk specifically about carbohydrates and our blood. So it's pretty cool. All right, so section 1. When we say carbohydrates, what we really mean is sugars, right? That's what we basically say in our everyday lives. We say sugars, and they do provide us with energy, right? And I'm talking about energy to move, but also energy to think, like you're studying right now, and you need energy to do that. And so carbohydrates can provide that sugar, that energy, right? That's stored inside of those sugars. So there are simple sugars, and then there are complex ones. And so our complex carbohydrates are things like starches and a lot of insoluble fibers that we find in plants. So our simple sugars really provide a lot of really, really important roles inside of our cells. They provide part of the backbone of DNA, our genetic material, DNA and RNA. And other sugars are sitting on the outside surface of our cells, kind of sticking out, and they let our bodies recognize this is our cell versus maybe a bacterial cell or something like that. So they're markers that sit on the surface of our cells and say, this is me, it's Dr. B's cells, or it's not, it's foreign, you can go ahead and kill that. And so there are some carbohydrates that do play a role in disease, like diabetes or lactose intolerance. And so we'll talk about those a little bit later. So the first thing is you have to be able to classify the different types of carbohydrates. And so the very simplest type of carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one, right? We've heard that before. Mono is one. And saccharous is the early Greek word for sugar. So monosaccharide, one sugar. And so these are the sugars that taste sweet to us, right? And we can't break them down into smaller carbohydrates. So the simplest one, glucose, table sugar, is C6H12O6. And this is a monosaccharide. So I've drawn here a molecule of glucose here. And so you can see, you know where all the carbons are, you know, right, where all these things meet. These are all carbons, right? And there's another carbon right there. So it's a 6-carbon sugar. You have hydrogens attached, but right, we don't draw those hydrogens. And then we have oxygens. There's one oxygen on the ring, and then all the other oxygens are alcohol groups or hydroxyl groups. You'll see it said either way. And that's where those oxygens are. All right, so monosaccharides, if you look here, they're gonna have carbon, they're gonna have hydrogen, and they're gonna have oxygen. And so you can do a general formula, just like we did with the alkenes and alkanes and all that, where you say your number of carbons, right? That's how many hydrogens you have times 2, and the number of carbons is equal to the number of oxygens. And it only works if you have 3 or more carbons, but everything above 3 carbons, it will work. And it's not like you have water inside of this molecule. You don't. It's just saying that if you have, let's say, 3 carbons, right? C3, let me do this, C3, then how many hydrogens would you have? Well, 3 times 2 is 6. So if you had 3 carbons, you would have 6 hydrogens, and then oxygen would be 3. So you have 3 oxygens, right? So you would say C3H6O3. Okay. All right, let's see. Now we make them a little more complex, and we get to a disaccharide. So a disaccharide are 2 monosaccharides that are hooked together. So if we were to look at this, right? Here we have at the top, I kind of drew it in for you. This is the same glucose molecule I drew on the other slide, We're going to take 2 glucose molecules. They look exactly the same. And all we do is we link them together. And we link them together with one of these hydroxyl groups here, and right here, right? These are the 2 that are going to form that bond between the 2, right? And so only one of the oxygens is going to be present in that new bond right there. So what are you going to have left over? You're going to have a hydrogen from one of them, and then you're going to have a hydroxyl group for another. Well, what is HOH? HOH is what, right? Okay, so you could go backwards with this reaction, right? You can split a disaccharide. If you have one disaccharide and you split it right here at this bond, right, you can make 2 molecules of a monosaccharide. So table sugar, right, is a disaccharide that can be broken up, and you can do it just through hydrolysis, right? Remember, in hydrolysis, you have to have that hydrogen in order to make your glucose and your fructose. But you don't have to know all the names. You don't have to know all the names yet. I'm going to teach you that. You just have to know disaccharide is 2, monosaccharide is 1. Now, you could have more than 2. You could have something that's 3 to 9. So if you have 3 to 9 monosaccharide units hooked together, that is going to be an oligosaccharide. So an example of a common oligosaccharide are the ABO oligosaccharides. So the ones that are on the outside of our red blood cells that tell us what blood type we are. And we'll talk in detail about that. All right, if you go more than 9, you get to 10. Now we're going to call it a polysaccharide. So here's for you to remember: mono is 1, di is 2, then you have oligo, which is 3 to 9, and then you have poly, which is greater than 10, right? So whenever we talk about oligosaccharides, polysaccharides, they could be linked in one chain. Like, remember we said a straight chain in our hydrocarbons, you could have a straight chain. Well, sure, you can have that in sugar units. You can have one continuous chain, or that chain can be branched, where you have a couple of carbons and then you have another chain coming off at an angle, right? An example of that is starch in plants. And starch, it gives the plants that structure, that rigidity, right, that it needs. And you can break starch down, it's a polysaccharide. You can break it down into chains of glucose that can then be used to produce energy. And that's how plants make starch when the sun's shining. And then when the sun goes down, right, they still need energy. So then they can break down their own starch and then they have energy. Okay, so here are just some examples. Here's our monosaccharide, right? Mono means 1, di means 2, oligo is 3 to 9, excuse me. And then poly is anything greater than 10. And look at here, up to 10,000, right? So you could have a lot. The only thing that your book didn't have was kind of to give you a visualization of unbranched and branched. So you can have unbranched is like your straight chain, right? So everything that we've drawn over here is a straight chain. But here we have an example of branched. So here's our initial straight chain, and then coming off of that straight chain, we have a branch. Coming off of that branch, we have another branch, right? So that's your difference between straight chains and branches. So whenever we eat things, right, we say you should have a lot of dietary fiber. Well, what is fiber? Fiber is really just carbohydrate that we can't digest with our own enzymes. And there are 2 different kinds of fiber. There's soluble fiber and there's insoluble fiber. Soluble, if something is soluble, that means that you add water to it and it will dissolve. So like you're making Kool-Aid or something like that, right? You pour those granules in and what happens to them? They dissolve in the water. So it's the same deal. So soluble fiber is a carbohydrate that you mix with water, and a lot of times what it does is it forms almost like a gel-like substance in our digestive systems. And so this makes us feel like we're full. And It slows our ability to break down the sugar and to absorb our sugar, and it actually slows down cholesterol absorption as well in our bloodstream. So it helps to, for us not to have like a real big sugar rush, and so it'll slow that, that sugar uptake. So there are some common foods that you probably know that are soluble fibers. So oatmeal, all of our different legumes, so beans, lentils, peas, those are all examples. Apples have good soluble fiber. Carrots have good soluble fiber. And you know, when you're making jellies, you're making anything that starts out as kind of a watery substance and then you thicken it, right? That's a fruit pectin that we use to make jellies, and those contain soluble fibers as well. So our opposite of that is insoluble fiber. Insoluble, as it sounds. And when you mix this fiber with water, it doesn't dissolve, so it stays separate. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It actually plays a very important role in our digestive system. This insoluble fiber has a laxative effect, and so it prevents constipation. So that's very important. The polysaccharide cellulose that comes from plants is an insoluble fiber. So you're going to find insoluble fiber in things like whole grains, seeds, brown rice, cabbage, vegetable stalks, like celery, right? That's a vegetable stalk. We eat the stalk part of it, and all kinds of vegetable skins. So that's why it's always good to eat the skins on your potatoes or, you know, whatever it is. All right, so let's go do some practice problems. All right, so here we got our 6.1 practice problems. Classify the following carbohydrates as a monosaccharide, disaccharide, oligosaccharide, or polysaccharide. The only thing I would say is to kind of write your numbers on top so that you know ahead of time. Poly is greater than 10. So kind of just keep that in mind so that before you start to answer these questions, you already know how you're going to classify them. Okay, carrageenan, a seaweed extract containing 25,000 carbohydrate units. 25,000 is indeed greater than 10, so this is a polysaccharide. Okay, Levin's, soluble fiber containing 3 to 6 carbohydrate units. 3 to 6 falls into our 3 to 9, so this is an oligosaccharide. And I'm just going to write the prefix. Maltose containing 2 glucose units. 2 tells us that is a disaccharide. Okay. Identify the following as characteristics of soluble or insoluble fiber. So if it is soluble, by definition, it can mix with water. So that is the actual definition of soluble. So that is soluble. Can lower our blood cholesterol. That is soluble. And then has a laxative effect. That was our insoluble fiber. Okay, and that is all of our practice problems. Super easy for this section. And that's it. Have a great rest of your day.